When police broke down the door of the suburban farmhouse, the stench of iron hit them like a wall. Blood was everywhere, on the walls, in the sink, seeping through the floorboards. Yet not a single body was found. No signs of life. No sounds. Just silence and blood. The first officers to step inside the house would later say they knew something was wrong the moment they crossed the threshold. It wasn't just the silence, it was the heaviness in the air, the way the house seemed to hold its breath. The door had been ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze, and the neighbor who called it in had mentioned something about a foul odor. That was an understatement. Inside, the scent was overwhelming, a thick metallic tang that clung to their clothes and curled their stomachs. It was the unmistakable smell of blood. At first glance, the living room appeared normal. A few toys lay scattered near the television. A glass of water sat on a side table. Nothing broken, nothing overturned. But then one of the officers noticed the floorboards, dark streaks that led into the hallway like something had been dragged. They followed it in silence, guns drawn, every creak of the wooden floor sending a spike of tension up their spines. And then they saw the kitchen. Blood covered nearly every surface. It was pooled beneath the fridge, splattered across the walls, and smeared in hand-like shapes along the cabinets. It looked as though someone, or multiple people, had been killed there violently. But there were no signs of a struggle. No broken dishes, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds or signs of resistance. Just the blood. A staggering amount of it. They moved cautiously from room to room, the horror building with each step. In the hallway, crimson handprints trailed along the wall at waist height. The bathroom sink was half filled with pink-tinged water, and on the mirror, someone had written a phrase in what looked like dried blood. It wasn't supposed to happen. The message only deepened the mystery. Who wrote it? What? In the children's room, the scene was even more chilling. 2 beds neatly made. Stuffed animals lined up in a row. On the nightstand, a school assignment was left unfinished. But near the closet door was another dark streak leading into the hallway. No signs of the children. No signs of their parents. The master bedroom was eerily untouched, except for the bloody fingerprint on the light switch. Whoever did this had either tried to clean something, or left that mark deliberately. It made no sense. There were no bullet holes. No shell casings. No weapons. No screams had been reported. The family's car was still parked in the driveway. Their shoes sat by the front entrance. A fresh loaf of bread was still soft in the kitchen. Everything in the house screamed of normalcy, until it screamed horror. The juxtaposition was staggering. The mundane against the grotesque. The ordinary against something that felt calculated. Forensics arrived and were immediately baffled. They collected samples, swabbed for DNA, and tried to determine how many people had bled, and how much. Early estimates were grim. The volume of blood found throughout the house was more than enough to account for the deaths of all 4 family members. But without bodies, nothing could be confirmed. There were no drag marks out the door. No blood trail leading into the yard. It was as if the victims had simply dissolved where they stood. The oddest detail was in the dining room. The table had been partially set, plates arranged neatly, napkins folded. A pot roast sat cold and congealed in the center, untouched. One chair had fallen sideways, and beneath it was a pool of blood shaped like a person had collapsed there. But again, no body. No hair. No signs of movement afterward. Just that single red puddle and an abandoned meal. Detectives began to consider possibilities outside the normal. Was it a staged scene? An elaborate disappearance masked as a murder? Or worse, was it something they couldn't explain? The neighbors were questioned thoroughly. Most reported hearing nothing unusual, except for one woman across the street who claimed she saw flickering lights at odd hours and thought she'd heard someone crying the night before. A child's voice. But when she looked outside, the house was still and dark. That kind of bloodshed leaves an imprint, not just physically but emotionally. The crime scene photos leaked months later would become infamous online. People would debate for years whether it was real or a hoax. But the investigators who walked that house, who smelled that blood, who touched those walls, they never questioned its authenticity. What kept them awake at night wasn't just the violence. It was the absence. There were no signs of where the family had gone, no trace of where the blood ended. It was like the house had swallowed them whole and sealed itself shut behind a curtain of silence. And perhaps most disturbing of all was the chilling realization that whoever had done this, if someone had done this, left the door open. Not kicked in. Not broken down. Just open. As if inviting someone else inside. The investigation shifted quickly from shock to confusion. The house on Elmridge Lane was treated as a high-priority crime scene, But with no bodies, no known suspects, and no traceable motive, detectives were left grasping at shadows. The first line of inquiry was simple. Where was the family? Every angle was considered. Kidnapping? Mass murder? An elaborate disappearance? But nothing fit. The family had simply vanished into thin air. Police began combing through their personal history, hoping to find some clue. The father, Thomas Reilly, was a civil engineer with no criminal record or known enemies. The mother, Laura, worked part-time at the local library. Their teenage daughter, Megan, was a quiet student who excelled in science, and their younger son, Caleb, had just turned 10. They weren't wealthy, political, or involved in anything questionable, at least not on paper. To neighbors they were as typical as it got. Detectives turned to technology hoping for a trail. But what they found was even more disturbing than the blood in the house. All digital activity related to the family stopped on the same evening, 3 nights before the house was discovered. Phones were turned off around 8:14 p.m. The last text message sent from any of the family's devices was a brief, "almost home" from Thomas to Laura, sent while driving. Security footage from a gas station verified that he'd stopped to refuel on the way back from work. After that, nothing. No outgoing calls. No banking activity. No online purchases. Not even a login to the family's shared streaming account. It was as if their digital lives had frozen. When police attempted to access their social media accounts for more context, they were met with an unexpected hurdle. The profiles were gone. Not just deactivated, completely erased. Facebook, Instagram, email accounts, every trace of their online presence had been scrubbed. And no one in the family was tech-savvy enough to do it, let alone with such thorough precision. Investigators contacted the platforms directly, but the responses were chillingly vague. Logs showed the deletions occurred at roughly 3:08 a.m., the night everything stopped. No known IP address. No login location. No recovery option. It was as if someone had flipped a switch and made them digitally disappear. Neighbors began to talk. Rumors swirled. Some said they'd heard strange humming noises in the nights leading up to the discovery. One woman described waking up to a low-frequency vibration that rattled her windows, only to find everything quiet when she stepped outside. A teenager from down the street claimed he'd seen flickering lights coming from the Reillys' upstairs bedroom, a rhythmic pulsing glow that didn't match any known electrical pattern. But no one had thought much of it at the time. It was just a family being a little strange, until the blood. The most alarming account came from a man named Richard Daly, a retired schoolteacher who lived 2 houses down. On the night the Reillys vanished, he said he had taken his dog out around midnight. That's when he saw movement in the Reillys' backyard, 3 silhouettes. At first he thought they were burglars. But as he looked closer he saw they weren't moving like normal people. Their motions were fluid, deliberate, almost too slow, like they were walking underwater. He described one of them as having limbs too long for its body. He called the police that night, but by the time an officer cruised by hours later, the house was still and quiet. No report was filed. The soil in the backyard had been disturbed, freshly turned over in multiple spots. A forensic team began digging. They found nothing. No bones, no personal items, no signs of burial. Just dirt. Yet it had clearly been dug up and flattened again with intention. No natural explanation sufficed. And with no physical remains, the case couldn't even legally be considered a homicide. Friends of the family were interviewed in waves. Some admitted that, in the weeks before their disappearance, the family had become increasingly distant. Megan had stopped texting her best friend without warning. Laura had canceled a book club meeting with no explanation. Thomas's co-workers said he'd been distracted, even paranoid, double-checking locks, watching the parking lot from his office window. Something had been happening inside that house, something none of them had shared. The Reillys hadn't been on any vacation or left town. Their passports were found untouched in a drawer. Their bank accounts had no withdrawals. Their phones were later located via triangulation, all showing their last signal within the property limits, inside the house. It was like they had simply ceased to exist within the very walls they once called home. Days stretched into weeks, then months. National news covered the mystery, labeling it the house that bled. Amateur sleuths posted endless theories. Satanic cults, witness protection gone wrong, even supernatural abduction. Yet the police remained disturbingly silent, as if unable to make sense of the evidence they had. Behind closed doors, however, agents were beginning to consider a darker possibility, that whatever happened in that house may not be solvable by traditional means. The crime scene, the deleted records, the lack of bodies, nothing followed a recognizable pattern. And perhaps most unsettling of all, when a second, deeper forensic sweep was conducted weeks later, a technician reported finding a single sentence carved faintly into the underside of the family's dining table. It read, "They're not gone. Just beneath." What that meant, or who wrote it, no one could say. But it was the last new clue the investigation would ever uncover. The discovery of the concealed basement was not part of the original search. Weeks had passed and investigators had combed through every inch of the house, or so they thought. It wasn't until a meticulous forensic architect compared the official blueprints of the Reilly residence to the physical structure that the anomaly became obvious. The dimensions didn't line up. There was unused space directly beneath the master bedroom, sealed off and unaccounted for. A hidden void. That realization was followed by dread. What else had they missed? A specialized team was brought in, outfitted with ground-penetrating radar and structural tools. At first, the suspicion was that it might be a construction oversight or old storm shelter. But what they found was far from accidental. Beneath the oak floorboards of the bedroom, boards that had been expertly reinforced to hide the entry, they uncovered a tightly fitted panel. It was nailed down and sealed with a thin layer of caulk that had been painted over, almost surgically precise. Whoever had hidden it knew exactly what they were doing. It took several hours to safely remove the panel without damaging potential evidence. Beneath it, a narrow hatch was revealed. The hinges were rusted but functional. As the door creaked open, a breath of foul, trapped air wafted out. It reeked of mold, old wood, and something worse, something metallic and organic. The smell of decay without a source. The descent was steep. A single wooden ladder led down into the darkness. The walls of the shaft were raw concrete with strange, shallow gouges etched into them. Not quite scratch marks but not tool marks either. Just impressions. Silent warnings. At the bottom, the room opened into a low, rectangular chamber roughly 15 feet wide and 20 long. It had no furniture. No lights. Just a bare bulb dangling from the ceiling, controlled by a switch above ground. When the light flickered on, what they saw defied easy classification. Symbols. Dozens of them drawn in black and red, some painted, others etched into the walls. Circles interlocked with triangles, spirals nested in squares, crude depictions of eyes, hands, and distorted human forms. The style was inconsistent, some childlike, others so intricately precise they looked printed. Yet none of the symbols matched any known language or ritual system. They appeared to be a mixture of influences or something entirely new. Ancient but wrong. There were bloodstains on the concrete floor, dried, cracked, and layered, indicating multiple instances of use. In the center of the room, a shallow depression had been carved, almost like a basin, stained dark as if it had held liquid over time. Around it, candle stubs sat in a perfect hexagon, their wax melted into the floor. Some had fingernail marks dug into them as if someone had clawed at the wax. Most chilling of all was the item placed dead center in the room, a small folded shirt. Child-sized. Light blue with cartoon dinosaurs printed across the front. It was soaked in blood, yet meticulously folded as if prepared for laundry. The tag read Caleb. There were no human remains, no bones, no personal effects beyond that. The floor was swept clean, the air unnervingly still. No signs of how the room was accessed beyond the single hatch. No drag marks. No footprints. The chamber existed in complete isolation, soundproofed with thick padding hidden behind the walls as later confirmed by the crime lab. Even screams wouldn't have escaped. When photos of the symbols were submitted to various experts, linguists, historians, cult specialists, none could provide definitive answers. A few said they resembled sigils from ancient Babylonian myth. Others argued they were fabricated entirely, possibly the work of someone delusional. But there was one pattern that disturbed every consultant. One recurring motif, drawn in multiple locations around the room. An eye with no iris, surrounded by teeth. Always drawn in thick red pigment. And always facing the same direction, toward the far wall. That wall, when scanned for density, revealed a thin cavity. Investigators prepared for excavation, thinking perhaps this was where the missing bodies were hidden. But when they broke through the wall, they found nothing but empty space. A sealed-off tunnel that ended after just 10 feet, filled with dirt. Still, inside that short passage they found something else. A series of scratches running along the upper portion of the tunnel, high up, spaced like desperate fingers. As if someone had tried to claw their way out. The public was never informed of the basement. Official reports left it out entirely, citing ongoing investigation. But internally the case grew cold. Nothing more was ever found, no suspects ever arrested. The Reillys remained missing, the evidence frozen in its incomprehensibility. Yet for those who had seen the basement, for those who had touched those walls, something had changed. A few of the officers later reported vivid dreams, visions of being trapped underground, surrounded by whispers. One quit the force altogether. Another stopped sleeping, afraid of what would come if he closed his eyes. There was a consensus among them, unspoken but palpable. The room hadn't been just a crime scene. It had been waiting. Months later, the house was sold at auction. The new owners gutted it entirely, unknowingly covering the hatch with marble tile. They never found the basement. But every now and then they said they'd hear something under the floor. A dragging sound. Faint scratching. As if something beneath was still trying to be heard.